bigger question of doubt. One of the big parallels that's often made here is with Descartes' method of skeptical doubt. And he asks, is all that is written in the sacred books true? I thought about it a lot, and I said, in spite of this, I did not understand. And I said, I will go and I will ask learned people and deep thinkers, and they will tell me the truth. This time being a little bit like Socrates, when Socrates hears that he's the wisest man in Greece, and he thinks, I'm going to go and talk to the really wise people and see what it is that they know. Socrates, of course, finds out that he's the most intelligent man in Greece because he knows he has the intellectual humility. And he poses this really as a problem which I take to be a kind of relativistic concern, right? He says, what will people answer me apart from what is already apparent in their hearts? All men say, my religion is correct, and those who believe in another religion believe falsely, and they are enemies of God. So the Jews, the Muslims, the Village, the Copts, they all have their own different views about the nature of reality. But when we ask them for their reasons for believing in one of them, all they point to is the fact that people point to what is already present in their hearts. If all of these standards of evaluation of beliefs are internal to those systems, how can we decide between them, right? Who would be the judge? Is a really nice way of putting the question. And what he could do is he could avail himself of the relativism sort of response, which would be the easy one, which I think is taken quite often these days, which is just to say that, they have their way of believing things, we have our way of believing things. Who's to know which one of these things is true? But he insists that that's not enough, right? He says truth, however, is unique. Religion may seem true, but truth has to be unique. And so he's going to be forced into this sort of inquiry where he's going to explain and he's going to understand what it is that allows us to find what the unique truth is going to be. This is what I take to be most original and most sort of striking and interesting about his positive contribution in that. He says, to the one who searches out, truth will quickly be revealed, because to the one who inquires with pure reason, which the Creator has put into the human heart, to see the rules and laws of creation, will find the truth. Okay? So who inquires with the pure reason that the Creator has put in? There's a human faculty, a mental faculty, something that all humans have, that allows us to tell, that allows us to distinguish between these various different alternatives. Because the Creator put into the heart of humans the light of intelligence, the Gəəz then there is the Lebuna, that they may see good and evil, right? The metaphor is really visual here. To recognize what is and is not their duty, to distinguish the truth from a lie, and then it's quoting the Psalms, how by your light, O Lord, we see the light. If we were to see by this light of our intelligence what is our duty, it cannot deceive us. Here's that analogy with Descartes and the clear and distinct ideas again. Because our Creator gave us this light that we may be saved by it, not that we may be destroyed. I won't continue with the whole quote. But the idea here is that humans have a faculty which, if it is used correctly, enables the distinction between merely false ideas, mere accumulations of what is merely said by men, and what we know by the divine faculty to be the truth. Okay? Now he uses this to do a number of different things in what remains of the treatise. I want to mention just a couple of the major points that we've gone over so far that I'm going to try and set the context for in the 17th century Ethiopian literary background, right? So the first thing is that it's not a biography. I was born in the lands of the priests of Axel. It follows one man's journey and one man's life. The second is it builds up a system, as we've seen in the last quotes, grounded in account of this divinely endowed faculty that Sumner translates as reason. The new translation, which is coming up next year, calls intelligence or understanding. But in Gəəz, which is Lebuna, the root of which is Laboa, which is the heart, which is a very interesting point. There's not this distinction that you have in so many Indo-European languages between the heart as the seat of emotions and the brain as the seat of intelligence. Lebuna has a sort of ambiguity between the two of them. The third, that it's based off of these problems of human difference, seeing what everybody else believes to be true. Fourth, that this is a faculty that is totally equal, totally evenly distributed. All men are equal in the presence of God, and all are intelligent since they are his creatures. He did not assign one people for life, another for death, one for mercy, another for judgment. One of my favourite lines from him. And fifthly, is that he uses this standard, this rational standard based on Lebanon, in order to critique various elements of established religion. He critiques fasting, for example. He critiques Mosaic purity laws that don't allow menstruating women to be able to come into the synagogue. He critiques Islamic polygamy, all on the basis of rational criteria, basically. So that's the Hatatar itself. I've already spoken a little bit about the 17th century context. I guess you guys already know about the wars of religion between the Muslims and the Christians beforehand, the fact that the Catholics come in a little bit later on, and that we then have the wars with the conversion of Socinius. I'll skip over that bit. And just say a very quick word about the controversy itself. So, obviously the text seems, it's an autobiography set in the 17th century, to be written by 17th century Ethiopian. But one thing that's quite striking is that there don't seem to be, and this is one thing I'd be really interested to hear if anybody in the room has any knowledge of, there doesn't seem to be any record of the text between its composition in the mid-17th century and its discovery and being sent to Europe in the mid-19th century. So it was discovered by this Italian missionary Giusto Turbino, who's in an area around here in Bethlehem, I think is the town, near Lake Tana. And he sends it back to Paris, where it remains today. It's in the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. You can go and consult it if you ever happen to be in Paris. It's an incredibly beautiful book. It's made out of parchment with the wooden boards and the leather embossment. It's really beautiful. And the first European scholars to come across it take it very seriously as a work of philosophy. A Russian scholar called Boris Turayev translates it into Russian in 1904. A German scholar named Enno Littmann translates it in 1909 into Latin. It's still translating to Latin in the 20th century. And it starts to get a lot of interest in European scholarly communities until in 1920, an Italian scholar named Carlo Conti Rossini, one of the great Ethiopian linguists of the early part of the 20th century, writes an article claiming that this book is a fake. It's not composed by a Tigrayan monk in the 17th century. It's composed by the person who supposedly discovered it, Giusto Turbino, 2 centuries later. Now, he has a number of arguments for this. There's supposedly an Ethiopian priest who sort of tells him that Giusto Turbino and his Ethiopian friends were getting up to some mischief and coming up with these texts. But one of his big arguments is that the text is supposedly impossible in an Ethiopian context. We couldn't imagine such a rationalistic, open-minded work being composed in 17th century Ethiopia, according to him. He says ideas such as those of Zera Yacob would not be expected in Ethiopia, where blind faith and Byzantism of interpretation oppose an insuperable barrier to free thinking. Okay? Now, it just so happens that Carlo Conti Rossini, very shortly after writing this, also wrote articles very enthusiastically supporting Mussolini's invasion of Ethiopia. These two things may be connected. It's up for those scholars to decide. But what I want to do basically today is to reject Conti Rossini's point that this is unthinkable in the Ethiopian context. I want to say that we're going to give some examples today that show exactly how this text could have emerged from the context of 17th century Ethiopian literature, that many of the things that are most interesting about it already appear in different forms in other texts from the same sort of period. And I'll focus on 3 main things. The first one are philosophical precedents, earlier works of philosophy in Gəəz literature. The second one is going to be first personal writing, people who are doing maybe not autobiography, but writing texts which are focused on the individual. And the third one is to reject Conti Rossini's point about Ethiopia being a place of religious dogmatism. I want to say that there are lots of different competing religious ideas which are going on at that time. So starting with philosophical precedents. So the Hatatar is quite simply not. One thing that people often say is that the Hatatar is the first work of philosophy, the first autobiography in Africa. Neither of those things are true. Claude Sumner has 5 volumes of Ethiopian philosophy, in which he mentions a number of different books which are written in Gəəz, which can be classed as philosophy. I'm only going to have time to focus on one of them today, the Matafal Tabiban Falsafa, or the Book of Wise Philosophers, as he calls it. And I want to say that there are deep continuities between this work and between the Hatatar, even in the words they use. So last year I managed to go out to Minnesota, to the Hill Museum and Manuscript Library, which was the place that the late Getachew Haile spent most of his scholarly career. doing this incredible life's work of cataloguing all of the Ethiopian manuscripts that are held there. And they have, I think, 13 different versions of the Falsafa manuscripts. And these are texts which were very widely distributed across Ethiopia. They're found all over the country. They're very popular books. They were read in lots of different places, and they were widely changed. So the early editions of them are very short, like this sort of big, the ones from the 17th century. The ones from the 19th century are about this big, because people keep adding ideas. They keep adding sort of stories about the philosophers. And one of the main things that I found interesting is I wanted to see, I'll tell you a bit more about the first. So there are many cases where we think that this is a text which appears in translation, originally from a Greek work, translated into Arabic, then into Gəəz. There are many famous philosophers who appear in there. There's Socrates, who is Socrates, there's Aflaton, who is Plato, there's Diogenes. Here's just one example. I was translating with my teacher of Gəəz about a saying from Diogenes the Wise. And one thing that's interesting is, although it's a translated work, the Ethiopian text is totally different from the original Greek. It really is an original work by the time it arrives in Gəəz. And one thing I was interested to see is whether the same sort of terms would be popping up in these things. And the term that I thought was most interesting, appeared on the very first page of these Falsafa manuscripts. And it appeared all over them throughout in much the same sort of sense, in the sense of a faculty of reason or understanding or intelligence in some way. So that suggests to me that there are already philosophical works going on that somebody like Zera Yacob might have looked back to, might have compared his ideas with. The second one is the point about autobiography. It's repeated a lot that there are no autobiographies before the 17th century in Ethiopian literature, but this is not true. In the edited volume for the conference that me and Fazil are working on, there's a really good article by a professor called Anaïs Rion, who actually does think that the Hattat is a forgery, but she makes a really interesting case that there are these cases of autobiographical writing. This is from an aristocrat named Semon, who inserts these sort of autobiographical sections into a manuscript of the Telema Maria, the Miracles of Mary. And they're all sort of bragging, they're all saying how rich he is, how many slaves he owns, how many animals he has, all of that sort of thing, which don't really seem very appropriate for a religious manuscript, but are all in the first person, or all reflecting on his own life, like the Hattat does. Another one is the writing of one Abba Pavlos from the 16th century, which is a really interesting text for all sorts of reasons. But number one, because he's trying to construct scientific history and locates his own life and his own experiences throughout that. The third one is not strictly apt for the argument I'm making now, because it's not composed in Ethiopia, but it's composed by an Ethiopian, by this very handsome and dashing looking man on the left here. It's called Saga Christos, who was a bit of an Ethiopian adventurer in 16th century Europe, who claimed to be the rightful heir to the Ethiopian throne, and who sort of went around Europe befriending a number of famous philosophers in Rome and Paris, such as Thomas Campanella, before he died. And he wrote an autobiography, which does seem to be the first published autobiography by an African writer. I really recommend this article by Matteo Salvatore, I Was Not Born to Obey, but Rather to Command. It's self-fashioning. I can send that to anyone if they're interested afterwards. Moving on to the third point, Conti-Rossini's idea that there's just religious dogmatism, that there's no room for critical thought. Another one of the interesting papers at the conference was given by Binyam Makonnen, who used to be in the philosophy faculty here. He gave a paper about the Dakika Stephanos, which was a heretical sect in, I think, 15th century Ethiopia, who were opposed to Zera Yacob, the emperor, not the Zera Yacob, the philosopher. Which just demonstrates really that you do have this kind of dissent, you do have these alternative critical ideas towards religious orthodoxy at the time. They might not have been as radical as Zera Yacob in some way. They're still monks, they're still Christians. Zera Yacob arguably departs from Christianity altogether, but it certainly demonstrates that there is room for this kind of critical religious thought. I want to say just a little bit more. I'm going to go a little bit quickly through this so that we can get to sort of the big takeaway picture and some questions at the end. But just to say a little bit more about the context, where we have this religious polemic that he's in, where he has to flee from the court of the emperor. We have a very famous text which is called the Gadla Walata Petros, about Walata Petros, who's a female saint. It exactly the same time as Zera Yacob, who's involved in exactly the same conflict between the Catholics and the Ethiopian Orthodox. Now, in this text, it's more sort of focused on the political and the theological differences rather than the philosophical ones. But it certainly shows that we have a text with exactly the same literary sort of setting that corroborates a lot of the historical details. The other thing to maybe add is that the literary form, obviously there's nothing in the Haggadah that says this is an autobiography. There's no word, as far as I know, in Gəəz for autobiography. It's called a Gadol, a struggle, a life, like a hagiography, like you have all of the Ethiopian saints. The second case would be that of the Kasa Amin of Enbakom. So this is a text which Enbakom, who's originally from Yemen, comes to Ethiopia, is one of the great translators, seems to have known Arabic, Gəəz, Coptic, Hebrew, Syriac, Armenian, Portuguese, Italian. And he writes this text which is addressed to Ahmed Ghani, the head of the Adal Sultanate, is the way that this text is presented, and is a critique of Islam. And it's coming, as it does, from Enbakom, who was born a Muslim, a really strong appreciation and understanding of the ideas he's criticising, as well as a knowledge of Neoplatonic philosophy, which he uses in his criticisms of Islam. So we know that there were these intelligent, reason-based critiques of religion in the same sort of context. Heading on to the point of cultural difference, I've mentioned already that I think one of the central themes of the Haggadah is cultural and religious difference between peoples. And the 17th century context in which you have Catholics, you have the Europeans, and you have the Ethiopians coming into context just after you've had the Muslim Christian wars of religion, are ones in which people are being forced to reflect on their own cultural practices. I mean, the way I've always thought about it is, if you come into contact with a really unfamiliar culture, there are kind of two different reactions you can have. Maybe more than two. But there are two basic forms of reaction where you can say either, this is some kind of, this is a really challenging, threatening to the way I do things. Is the way I go about doing things, is my religion, are my ethics the right ones? Or has my confidence in it been undermined by my encounter with this other, with this alternative? Or one can say, actually, my culture or my way of doing things is the right way of doing things, and I'll come up with a rationale, an objective way of proving why this is the right way. And this seems to me to be exactly the same problem that's encountered in a text by another Ethiopian emperor, by Gelawdewos, which is known as the Confessio Fidei in Europe at least, in which, in response to the Portuguese missionaries saying, oh, Ethiopian Christianity has all of these strange practices, why don't you eat pork, why do you circumcise your children, isn't this just Judaism? And he says, well, actually, regarding, say, for example, the eating of the flesh of animals, there is no law and no canon in the book of the New Testament, so it's not a religious thing. To the pure, everything is pure, and Paul says, who believes may eat everything. So he's drawing a distinction between the religious laws and between mere custom, right? Drawing this distinction between the different ways of doing things. And this is very similar to that initial quote I had from the Haggadah, I think. And I said the foreigners say these things and the Copts say these things. I did not say this interpretation is good, this interpretation is bad. Rather, I said all of these interpretations are good if we ourselves are good. Seems a really striking parallel to me. Another case that would be quite interesting, this is not one that I'm nearly so familiar with, this is the only one I'm having to rely on secondary literature for, is the Zinapogala by Ababati, which is obviously one of the first ethnographical works, which is written about trying to understand a foreign society from within the Ethiopian context. The secondary source text I have here are from Mahmoud Hassan's text about the Oromo, and he mentions that the value of this work stands out because of the ability of the author to rise above the ignorance of his society and exhibit an understanding of the Oromo social organisation as the source of their strength. As a result, he produces an interesting and precise picture not only of the Oromo society, but of his own society as well. It's this moment of coming into contact with the alternative culture, being forced not only to understand the alternative, what's in front of you, but holding a mirror up to you yourself to have to try and understand yourself better as well. Now that's all I really wanted to say about the Ethiopian context. I want to say a couple of words about how, if we really want to understand this text, just understanding this bit of the world here is not quite enough. We need to zoom out all the way to the global level. And that's because the context of Zera Yacob's philosophy is in the context much more broadly of Eastern Orthodox philosophy and Eastern Orthodox thought. I'm going to skip through some of these points because they're not quite so strict, but all of the texts that we were talking about before, the Methodological, they're circulating in a network all the way from Russia in the north to Ethiopia, all the way out to India, all the way out to Spain. All of these texts are in constant circulation. All of these ideas are part of a transnational, translinguistic network of ideas. Okay? I think I've made the point sufficiently about the idea that these texts are not maybe so simple as they need to be. So I'll skip over this bit as well. But the first point is that we're involved in a network of Eastern Orthodox thought. The second one is that Ethiopia is located very close to some of the major centres of Islamic thought. Enno Littman, the first editor of the text, suggested that a cosmological argument, as you probably know, being the idea that what was the cause of me, my parents, what was the cause of my parents, my grandparents, what was the cause of them, going backwards and backwards and backwards, right until we have to get to a very first point, and then we argue that there must have been one uncaused cause, which is the creator of the world, therefore God exists. Basic idea of the cosmological argument that Littman suggested may have come from medieval Islamic philosophy. Now, how much intellectual influence there is in the Horn of Africa between Islamic and Christian worlds is something which seems to be very understudied. But in the example that we had of Enbakom, somebody born a Muslim who comes up with pro-Christian polemics against Islam, would be one example that there is really interesting interaction which is going on in that way. And finally, this is the point that's really going to make it totally global and that we'll be able to get towards the end with. So Zera Yacob talks about having these arguments, listening to the Ethiopian teachers and listening to the Ferenc. Who are these Ferenc? Well, these are Jesuits. These are Jesuits who are part of the world's first global intellectual network to go and preach Christianity to different peoples of the world. Now, they're all over the place. They're in America, translating the Bible into Algonquin and into Aztec languages and all of that stuff. They're also in India, in Japan, in China, in Ethiopia. Now, in Ethiopia and China and Japan, they were considered that the people who were going to preach had to be extremely educated because they were going to ancient literate societies. And what they would do in places like Japan and Ethiopia is that they would bring books. In particular, they'd bring theology and philosophy texts, and they would translate them into the local languages. Some of the earliest printed books in Ethiopian languages were bought by the Jesuits in order to try and impress Ethiopians. They tried to bring these big books with golden height on them and stuff like that, because they thought that this is something that would be able to make their point to the people there. And really modern new research which is going on right now by Leonard Cohen at the University of Ben Gurion in Israel has noted that, number one, we have texts which are written by Jesuit missionaries in Gəəz in the 17th century, trying to preach to the Ethiopians. And many of these texts mention some names which are quite striking if we're thinking about an interconnected history of philosophy. So this one here reads, Augustinos Licamer. So, Augustine, St. Augustine. The one down here is Wakadus Thomas Aquinas. So we have Thomas Aquinas, translated in Gəəz texts in the 17th century. So it would be no surprise that Zera Yacob would be coming up with such interesting arguments. It would be no surprise that he's evaluating the teachings of his own country and the very best teachings that Europe has to offer as well. He's part of an international global network. The same is going to be true for the Japanese people who are reading these Jesuit texts and who are responding to it. And I think that this is a really important point to make, because when we make the comparison, for example, we'll come back to this. Actually, no, I'll go back to it first. There's a comparison which is often made between Zera Yacob and Descartes. There's a lot of similarities in their ideas, and I think if we just point to, look, they both have methodical doubt, or they both have a cosmological argument, or they both have or a theory of reason. It's interesting to point that out, but we can do a lot better than that. We can say that Zera Yacob is in debate with the Jesuits, and Descartes is educated in France in the 17th century by Jesuits. They're responding to the same text. They're coming up with their own idiosyncratic, locally inflected responses to similar sort of texts. If there are parallels between Descartes and Zera Yacob, they can be historically substantiated. And we can carry these historical parallels to a truly global level because we know that these things are happening all over the world, right? And I think that that's a really useful way to think about the history of philosophy going forward, that doesn't just have Western philosophy here, Eastern philosophy here, African philosophy here. We can see, if we trace the historical lineages of these things, the ways in which there's already in the 17th century a truly global conversation and exchange of philosophical ideas. And it's not all one way. It's not like it's just European scholars taking their ideas to different parts of the world and people passively responding to it, right? The Ethiopians didn't accept this. The Ethiopians kicked out the Jesuits. They didn't accept these arguments. Zera Yacob talks about the fact that they didn't agree with my reason. They got kicked out of Japan as well. These ideas didn't win. These ideas are going both ways. And a really interesting example of that, which is just another couple of points that I want to make just before we finish, about the fact that the 17th century, I think, is a truly global story in the history of philosophy. These blue dots that I've got here are places I think where significant things were happening in 17th century philosophy. One of them, the one that's happening here in New Delhi, is at the same time as Zera Yacob is around, we have the translation of Descartes into Persian and into Hindi by this guy Francois Bernier, who's a physician at the book Court. At the same time that that's happening, Hindu texts are being translated into European languages, are coming back. Hindu texts are the major influence on Arthur Schopenhauer, and then on Nietzsche, and then on Wittgenstein, on a whole stream of European thought, like formative of it. The same sort of idea is happening when the texts are coming back from the Jesuits about Ethiopian Christianity. They're coming back to Spain and Portugal, and these texts are being used to argue in the Reformation. Martin Luther explicitly talks about the fact that Ethiopian Christianity, which he considered to be the oldest and the purest form of it, was much more similar to Protestantism, he thought, than to Catholicism. So he was arguing that in breaking away from the Catholic Church, he was returning to the original Christianity. So these ideas are being used from one side of the world. They may be originally coming out from the Jesuits, spreading out from Europe, but these ideas are coming back and are forming what is already, I think, a truly global story, and one that really gets overlooked if we insist on just history of Western philosophy, history of African philosophy here. It's always already been global. And I think I'll end on that one.
I think now we can take some questions, comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And first of all, I would like to thank our colleague from the Department of Linguistics for solving our problem. Many thanks.
Thank you.
And again, Jonathan, I would like to thank you for the comprehensive presentation. I have some questions. Now, you and your colleague translated a book written by a French historian. She also joined you when you translated it. So the title of that book is The History of a Genuine, Fake Philosophical Treatise. Zera Yacob and here, introduction, investigating on investigation. So as you know, this lady, that is Anis Vian, if I correctly pronounce his name, she categorically denied the very existence of philosophy in Ethiopia. So as you remember, she presented a paper in Oxford. Some of her resources were not really good. She was not familiar with Ethiopian authors, Ethiopian history, and so on and so forth. So she denied the fact that Zera Yacob is an Ethiopian philosopher, and Zera Yacob belongs to Ethiopian philosophical history. And you seem to have a different position now, so you're against this position. You said that Zera Yacob was written by Zera Yacob, who was really an Ethiopian. So, regarding the title of the book, what do you mean by the fake philosophical treatise? What does the word fake mean here? That's the first question. And the second question is, you also stated about the philosophical system which was embodied in account of divinely endowed faculty of lubona. That means heart. And as you said, Claude Sumner translated this word as reason. So according to Claude Sumner, for Zera Yacob, reason is the source of knowledge. And also by the point you raised earlier, for many Ethiopians, for many Ethiopian ethnic groups, the heart is also the source of knowledge. Our heart thinks. When you fail to do something, for example, the colleague will say, what does that mean? Does it mean that your heart doesn't think and so on? So are you saying that instead of reason, heart is the major cause of knowledge for the Yacob? That's the second question. And again, you were referring to Philosophizing, Masaf Philosopher, the philosophy of wise philosophers. So as you correctly said, the Ethiopian text is different from the original one, which was written in Greek. Similarly, Professor Claude Sumner also said that here we don't see a literal translation from the Greek text or from the Arabic text to the East text. So we see three important elements. The first one is addition, the second one is subtraction, and the third one is modification. So that is a good point. And finally, you seem to say that Zera Yacob was taught by the Jesuits. So you were saying that Zera Yacob was influenced by foreign religious thinkers and probably philosophers. But as you already know, Professor Claude Sumner was against this. Regarding the first text, Philosophizing, Masaf Philosophy, and so forth, he said yes, these texts were influenced by foreign beliefs, thoughts, and so forth. But regarding the works of Zera Yacob and Waldehiyot, it is an original Ethiopian contribution to philosophy. So he was not influenced by any foreign thinker. So can you comment on these two contradictory interpretations? Are you really saying that Zera Yacob was influenced by foreign thinkers?
So, yeah, all four really interesting questions. I'll answer them in the opposite direction. So the last one that you asked first about this question of influence and originality. So I guess I'm really glad that you asked that one, because I guess the last point that I was trying to make about the global context of thought in the 17th century is that I don't think there is a tension or a contradiction between originality and influence. I think if we already take the idea that philosophical thought is always something which is broad and which is always international, right back to the ancient Greeks, right? If we think that ancient Greek thought is not just the original contribution of Athens, but is influenced by ancient Egypt, is influenced by Babylonia, is influenced by Hittite civilization, then it doesn't take away from their originality that they were influenced by these things. I think it's undeniable that Zera Yacob is influenced, in some sense of the term, by Jesuit thought, because he says, in one of these quotes, right at the start, we've got the quote that I studied the sacred books, how the French interpret them and how the Copts interpret them. He says himself that he's engaging with their ideas. Now, this isn't to say that he's influenced in the sense that he's beholden to their ideas. He's a critical philosopher. He takes the Jesuit ideas and he says, interesting, but no, not good enough for me. But it's one influence on him. I mean, I'd say in the same way that I've been very influenced in studying philosophy by reading somebody like Heidegger. I hate Heidegger. I really don't like him. I think he was a nasty Nazi with reactionary politics and various sorts of things. I don't hate in all sorts of ways. There's a lot of things about his philosophy I don't like, but I'd say I'm hugely influenced by it in terms of trying to figure out what it is that I don't like about it and what to put to the side. And I'd say maybe Zera Yacob is similar in that sense, that he's taken the Jesuit ideas and he said, no, they're not good enough for me. But it strikes me that they're formative on his thinking, at least in the sense of they've given him something outside of his own local way of thinking. And I think that's maybe true of philosophy in general. We have to come up against something that's really difficult and challenging in order to be able to work out what it is that we originally think. So, I mean, I clarify, if it sounded like I was saying he was influenced by them in the sense that he just took Jesuit ideas, that's not true at all. I think that certainly they are originally...
Jonathan, he didn't cite any thinker.
No, he didn't cite it,
work,
but he doesn't cite any Ethiopian thinkers either. He doesn't cite anyone at all, and neither does Descartes. Because both of them have this posture of originality, that they're thinking for themselves. It's a big part of their thought that they are the individual solitary thinker. And I think in both cases they must have been influenced by people. I mean, there must have been church authors and church writers that Zera Yacob read as an Ethiopian who influenced his thought. But he doesn't want to acknowledge that because he's an individual, because of the man that he is, I guess. I would just want to say that I agree with you, that I think it is an original Ethiopian work in that sense. I just don't think that the influence takes away from that. The point about the heart or reason as well, I wouldn't say that it's that he's trying to think with the heart instead of thinking with reason, but just that maybe there's a sense in which, and I think it's a linguistic point, that because the word that means reason here, and again, whether we translate it as reason or not, I haven't really made my mind up. I think there are some cases where the translation that someone has as reason is really helpful, and some of them where it kind of over-determines philosophically the particular sentence. Sometimes it seems sort of more neutral, and it didn't agree with my understanding or something might be better. But it's just the fact that the word for it is to do with the heart. Maybe it means that we don't have this whole opposition between either you can be thinking emotionally, right? Like stop, just thinking with your heart. You need to think with your head. To have an idea that emotion and reason are fused in this sort of faculty, and this is the point that I didn't make at all when we were making the point about this one here. If we were to see by the light which is our duty, they may see good and evil, recognize what is true and false. This faculty of level is not just epistemic, it's not just truth and falsity, it's moral as well. That's one thing that's really interesting. That's one thing you don't have in Descartes at all. Descartes has to kind of tack his morals on at the end. Zera Yacob gets ethics and epistemology in one together. And I think that might be because of this different sense of the ambiguity of the term for heart. And what would be really interesting to do would be to have a linguistic study of how that works in other Semitic languages, and whether that's different to all Indo-European languages. But I don't know Arabic or Hebrew well enough to be able to say. One last one, the one about Professor Enes Rion's one. Why the word fake in the title? The title in French is L'histoire d'un vrai faux, and we just translated the faux there as a fake, as a forgery. We're translating Enes's work because I think it's just a really interesting article. I don't agree with her conclusions, but I think it's a really fascinating piece. I think it's a really interesting reconstruction and interpretation of the psychology of someone like Justin Dubino and why he might have wanted to fake it. I just don't agree with her that is the ultimate case. I think it's.
And why did you translate it? Why did you like it?
I think it's a really interesting. I mean, we've translated many things for this book. So we've got translation of Lippmann, Turayev. We translated Conti Rossini. We translated Conti Rossini's 35-piece Ethiopia is incapable of civil progress, which is a disgusting, racist piece of work. But I think it's an important one. I think it's important that people have that context so that they can read his work about the Hatata and think, this is the guy who's saying that Ethiopians can't do philosophy. He's also saying we should invade Ethiopia. Maybe those two things are connected. But we've also translated a bunch of other interesting pieces. We've translated, our friend Drew is translating a thesis in Amharic. We've translated Getachew Haile's most recent one where he argues that the Hatata is an Ethiopian work. translated all of them, just because I think it's worth people having all of that information in one place to be able to make their mind up.
Thank you, the presenter, Mr. Jonathan, for bringing linguistics and philosophy together. I don't know whether it's a philosophy of language or the linguistics of philosophy, but I just want to suggest that the texts that you presented in your slides, some of them are transcribed and very well transcribed. Some of them are not. And if your readers want to pronounce it well, I think transcription would probably help, like Buna, right? Yeah. It is Lebona kind of thing. Yeah. First I was confused, but when you told me that it's Lebona, right? Yes. I think in this it must be Lebona, and then by it has been modified as Lebona, right? It's a definite now. Yeah. I think transcription helps. That is how Professor Getachew Haile, writes most of his manuscripts. Yeah. And I just want you to comment on the contribution of philology in the analysis of all these very valuable and important texts from Gəəz. I'm wondering why you haven't mentioned this great discipline that very much contributes to your
absolutely.
Yeah. And regarding the Ethiopian philosophy, you mentioned African philosophy. I don't know whether that really makes sense to the European philosophers. I don't want to go into the details because I'm very I don't know much about philosophy. But if philosophy makes sense, right, in the Ethiopian context, I wonder what Professor Getachew Haile and other scholars have commented on this. I read Getachew Haile's Festivals, and I think he's a very good promoter of the Ethiopian philosophy, right? And I just want to, in Europe, as you mentioned, and Professor mentioned, people think that philosophy, in the real sense of the term, doesn't exist in an African country called Ethiopia, right? And I don't know, I'm skeptical whether they will definitely accept African philosophy at all. And, it's not surprising if Conti Rossini considered the Zera Yacob as fake. If there is something fake, it should be this comment of Conti Rossini, which should be labeled fake, right? Because Conti Rossini, from the outset, as you mentioned, he came to Ethiopia as a fascist soldier, and he contributed much of linguistics, right? And like neo-grammarians, by viewing Ethiopian languages from the European side, and his descriptions are good, but they are not at most excellent works, like other works by other Europeans. And this is probably lack of knowledge of linguistics, and probably his racist kind of approach. I learned from one of his texts when he was in Asmara. He wanted to collect data. He became a sudden kind of a surprising linguist. All of a sudden, I think he was not trained in linguistics before he came to Ethiopia. And he tried to collect data from Tidra and Bilen and other language, and he said, well, after working with me for a couple of hours, they just fled, right? They didn't like me. Maybe he mistreated them, maybe, well, there must be something that, his informants didn't like from his output. And his comment on the fakeness of this must be, challenging, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think with Conti Rossini in particular, it's strange because the whole reason that people accepted, because really after Conti Rossini, all of the European scholars agreed that it was a fake. Everybody was very interested in it before. People were writing books about it. There are texts from German linguists saying this text deserves, it should be in the pantheon of world literature, of philosophical text. And as soon as Conti Rossini wrote that, everybody started to ignore it. Even Lippmann and Turaya, they changed their minds. They said, oh, Conti Rossini must have been correct. This guy called Eugen Mittwoch wrote an article showing, further arguments that supposedly it was a fake. And at the start, everybody agreed with Conti Rossini because of who he was, because he was this famous scholar. Now it's almost like we have the opposite point, where because now people know his politics, and now people know that it's a little bit too convenient that you say that these people have no philosophy, and therefore they should also have no freedom. I think there's a really interesting story to be told about the development of colonial thinking in the 19th century, between the capacity for political freedom and the capacity for philosophy. I think this is a problem that goes back to Hegel, where he sort of talks about civilization as a teleological thing. And the higher societies develop philosophy and have democracy, the lower societies have mere religion and despotism. So if a society has philosophy, then it's worthy of freedom. So denying that a society has philosophy is a good way of denying that they have freedom. I think that's the connection between the stuff. Nevertheless, it may be true that the case is a forgery, even though he's a fascist. There may be other good arguments for it. That's one reason I think that Weon's argument is worth going through, because she takes a totally different approach to Conti Rossini. And whilst Conti Rossini is a racist, Anais Weon is not a racist. She's a really, really interesting scholar of Gondaric Ethiopian history. I haven't read much of her other stuff, but I'm very confident in saying that she doesn't share the politics of Conti Rossini. In terms of, I guess that already is part of your first question as well, about the contribution of philology. And to a large extent, the history of the debate about the Hatata is two different debates happening side by side. On the one hand, it's a scientific, philological debate. On the other hand, it's a debate in cultural politics, right? To be honest, Conti Rossini, as much as he's meant to be a great philologist, he was on the cultural politics side. But there was other work done by Getachew Haile, done by Claude Sumner, done by Eugen Mittwoch and other people, that really was just taking the tools of philology in order to try and understand whether this thing was forgery, where it was from, in the way that only philology can, right? This is the amazing thing about the discipline. You can take individual words, you can do comparisons, you can do statistical analysis, and you can come up with deductive arguments, almost like a logical or a mathematical case. When I'm trying to think of another good example. When they demonstrate that these texts from the Renaissance, which purport to be the codes of Constantine in Greek or Latin, and they demonstrate that these words were never used in Greek before a certain kind of century, that these kinds of conjunctions of different terms and phrasal verbs don't go together. When you've got a proof like that, it doesn't matter what the politics of the person is. If that proof is good, the argument's good. Right? In the same way that there is, the parallel I often think about that some of the philosophers will know is Gottlob Frege, who was the greatest logician since Aristotle. Had the great project of reducing all of logic to mathematics. And he was a violent anti-Semite. He was, before the Nazis were ever around, came up with numbers worked out for how to pack the Jews off on trains to concentration camps. But that has nothing to do with his logical theory. Whether his logical theory works or not depends on whether his logical theory works or not. It doesn't matter for his politics, as far as I can tell. For someone like Heidegger, it's more tricky. Does the politics affect the ideas itself? But I don't really know. The other reason I didn't talk so much about philology, if the first chapter of my thesis is good, philology, is my Gəəz is not good enough, really, to comment on these things. I really made an effort to learn Gəəz. Really difficult language, I found at least. Amharic is much more difficult, but Gəəz is still quite hard for someone that speaks an Indo-European language. But the level that philology is done at by people like Sumner, by Weon, by Getachew Haile, is just way over my head. Does that answer your question?
Well, the transcription thing then.
Yeah, no. In the written version, I do that. I was rushing a little bit to get this one.
Yeah, fine.
Thanks for the question.
Can we take more? If we do not any, I think I will take the privilege of moderating. I have kind of one comment and one question. And I'll begin with a question. perspective in the African philosophy debate. There is this debate in the African philosophy that whether we should take authorship as the only means of doing philosophy proper. So do you think that authorship does it have to be written in order to be called philosophy proper? Because I think the underlying assumption behind the debate that you have raised is that authorship is very essential for philosophy. And without authorship, there is no philosophy proper, which is basically influenced by what Mudimbe, in his book called The Invasion of Africa, calls the colonizing structure. That dichotomizes between society as civilized, uncivilized, written, oral, and so forth. So you could have taken the idea that this very debate could have been influenced by a Eurocentric attitude. The other interesting point that you raised, in which I want to just ask a question is, you talked about the global exchange of ideas, philosophy coming from Africa and going to Europe. And you took that for granted. You took that, I think you are saying that there is a whole lot of evidence showing that this was indeed the case. If so, do you think that philosophy cannot be qualified because there are people who say that there is just one philosophy, which is Western? Everything else, according to Facet, for example, is what he calls a resentment theory. They are resenting, they are saying that, we have also philosophy, because you are telling me that we do not have philosophy. So we basically keep on saying that we have philosophy, when in fact we have to show that we have one. Do you think if there was a global exchange of ideas, do you think that philosophy can be qualified at all? Can we say there is just philosophy, which is not just Western, which could just be called maybe global?
Yeah, so the first one, I definitely agree with you. I think that there's, if you're going to qualify it, then it's the possession of just about everyone that's in a global process in which it's gone. I think the idea that it's just a Western thing, I would totally disagree with. I mean, it seems to me like someone like Nagarjuna or Confucius is obviously, by any definition of philosophy, a philosopher, and they're in no substantive sense influenced by the Western canon. Of course, it really depends on what you want your definition ultimately to be, and me and Fazil have very different definitions, for example, of what philosophy is supposed to be. If philosophy is a particular logically grounded project of emancipatory politics, then maybe it's just a European thing. I think Binyam would argue that the Dike Stephanos have something like that already. I think some scholars of Indian philosophy could argue that that exists there. But fine, if you're defining it in that way as a narrow thing for your particular purposes, fine. It is. But I think there's a much more interesting provisional definition to take of philosophy, which would be one which is something quite general, which is something based in, maybe we don't want to say universal initially, but based in basic human predispositions, right? Humans look up at the stars at night and they think, wow, that's pretty big, Humans wonder, like, what's the right way for me to live my life? What's the right thing I should do? What's the right way for me to raise my children? What's the right way to act to others in society? What's the best way of organising ourselves for human happiness? Strikes me that those questions come up just about everywhere. They're elaborated to a more or less theoretical point based on a whole lot of things, based on whether you've got writing. For example, that was part of the other thing you were saying about authorship. It strikes me that you don't need writing to think about those questions, but you're going to think about them very differently once you do have writing. You've got a way of externalizing those thoughts, you've got a way of being abstract in a very different way than you had before. So I would want to say that there is philosophy in all sorts of parts of the world. I would say that Fazil's point about the whole resentment philosophy thing also does have a point, because I think there's a story to be told to do with that Hegelian story I was saying, where people are told you don't have philosophy so you can't have political freedom. where people had to say, actually, no, we do have philosophy, and therefore give us our political freedom sort of thing. So I think there's a story to be told about the reassertion of a European style of philosophy in the decolonial period in order to push that point forward. I think you see it in China in the 19th century, I think you get it in India in the early parts of the 20th century, and I think the debates about African philosophy in the 50s have that in the background, although they go much further than that. So that's the point about the global thing. The point about authorship is I think you're exactly on the money, and for me, the reason that I don't care so much about whether I don't mind translating Aeneas's thing which says that it's a fake, or whether I, where I stand on it, I don't mind if I'm wrong about this. If it is a fake, I don't mind that much, because what I'm interested in is the text. I'm interested in those ideas, these quotes on the board, these, all humans, men, there's no, what's the next one? This one, all men are equal in the presence of God, and all their intelligences, they're his creatures. He did not assign one for life and another for death, one for mercy and another for judgment. Beautiful, whoever wrote it, right? It was written by a 19th century Italian, I don't care. So in that sense, I think authorship really doesn't matter. We can get really hung up on that. Most Ethiopian texts, as far as I can tell, before the 15th century don't have an author. People don't sign off their names. You say it's a scribe in a monastery in Goja wrote this. And maybe that's the best way to do this, really. A hell of a lot of authorship is people wanting to parade around and say, this is my individual work of genius. And maybe that's the thing that you get in Descartes, that you get in Zera Yacob, that posture of total originality, which is not so helpful.
And there are more. We are expecting some from Fatih. Obviously.